The morning air hung thick with mist, curling around the cobbled streets like a ghost that refused to leave. The town was still waking, the faint hum of early risers filling the air, the rustling of newspapers, the distant chatter of a street vendor setting up his cart. A warm glow spilled from the windows of a small bakery where the scent of fresh bread and cinnamon drifted lazily into the cold. Just outside, at the edge of the golden light, a small, scruffy pup sat motionless. His fur, once soft and golden, was now streaked with dust and grime, clinging to his frail frame. His dark eyes, round and steady, weren't filled with the frantic hunger of a stray searching for scraps. Instead, they were locked onto something inside, the glass jar on the bakery counter glinting under the lights. Coins clinked into it as customers dropped their change, exchanging pleasantries with the woman behind the counter. Each time the metallic jingle rang out. The pup's ears twitched, his body leaning forward ever so slightly, as if the sound alone held some kind of meaning. Then, with slow determination, he picked up a small, tattered pouch that lay at his feet. Carefully, he nudged it forward, his nose pressing against the worn fabric. People passed him by, some with a curious glance, others with nothing more than a dismissive step to the side. A little girl tugged at her mother's coat, pointing at the strange sight. "Mommy, why is the dog holding a bag?" But the woman barely spared a glance, murmuring something about not touching stray animals. Inside the bakery, Mia wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron as she moved toward the register. The usual morning rush was beginning, and she had no time for distractions until she caught sight of something through the window. At first, it was just another stray. The town had its fair share of them, most of whom lingered near the alleys, surviving on whatever scraps they could find. But this one was different. He wasn't searching for food. He wasn't whining or pawing at the door for warmth. He was sitting, waiting, watching. Her gaze dropped to the tiny pouch in front of him. It was frayed at the edges, barely holding together but unmistakably purposeful. He nudged it forward again, this time toward a passing man. Mia's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary dog. The town had a way of forgetting things. Its quiet streets and familiar routines moved forward like a well-worn path, never pausing to look back. People woke to the hum of coffee machines and the scent of warm bread, stepping into their day with the same rhythm they always had. Strays wandered the alleys, darting between parked cars, scavenging for scraps, but they were ghosts, seen but never truly noticed. A part of the town yet forgotten all the same. But there was one who refused to be ignored. Near the heart of town, where the morning sun painted golden streaks along the bakery's windows, a lone dog sat in patient silence. He was small, scruffy, his once golden fur dulled by time and dust. His ribs pressed faintly against his thin frame, but hunger wasn't what held him there. His dark eyes, steady and unwavering, fixed on the crowd moving past him. He did not beg, did not whimper. He simply waited. People came and went, lost in their own lives. A businessman hurried by without a glance. A mother tightened her grip on her child's hand, steering clear. A group of teenagers pointed and laughed before disappearing around the corner. No one stopped. No one asked why he sat there, a tattered pouch clutched gently in his mouth, nudging it forward toward strangers as if offering something unseen. Mia was different. The scent of flour clung to her apron as she pushed open the bakery door, her tired eyes scanning the street before landing on the pup. She had noticed him before, always in the same spot, always with the same quiet purpose. Other dogs roamed in packs, chasing shadows and scavenging scraps, but this one was alone, always alone. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepping forward, until she was close enough to see the delicate stitching along the edges of the pouch he carried. It was old, frayed, as if it had been clutched in small hands long ago. The dog looked up at her, eyes deep with something she couldn't quite place. Was it hope? Expectation? Grief? The morning breeze ruffled his fur as he nudged the pouch toward her, the softest whimper escaping his throat. Mia knelt, hesitating before brushing her fingers over the fabric. It was worn smooth from time, its edges slightly damp from where he had held it between his teeth. Coins clinked inside, her brow furrowed. A stray with money? It made no sense. She looked up again, searching his face for an answer, but the dog only tilted his head slightly, waiting. Intrigued, she glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed this peculiar ritual. But people walked by without a second thought, the world moving forward as if the silent collector did not exist, yet every morning he was there. And every evening, he vanished. The next morning, she watched more closely. He arrived with the first light of dawn, settling into place outside her bakery like clockwork. He would sit, watching, waiting for coins to be dropped into his pouch. No barking, no chasing, no desperate scrambles for food, just patience, as if he had done this before, as if he knew exactly what he was meant to do. She followed him with her eyes as he moved, weaving through the streets in a pattern so precise it couldn't be random. She saw the way he flinched near certain buildings, his body tense with a memory he couldn't shake. Certain streets made him pause, his paws shifting uneasily before he found another way forward. It was as if the town itself held echoes he could hear, but no one else could. That night, when she finally closed the bakery, Mia walked past the old newsstand at the corner of the street, something in the window catching her eye. The newspaper was faded, yellowed with age, but the headline made her stop. Local boy's tragic accident leaves shelter unfinished. Her heart pounded as she stared at the grainy photo beneath the words. A young boy stood there smiling, a small dog at his feet. His hands clutched a sign that read, "Help us save them." Mia's breath caught. The dog in the picture was smaller, younger, but the same. Her eyes darted toward the street where the scruffy pup had disappeared just hours before. The realization sent a chill through her. This wasn't just a stray. This was a story the town had forgotten. But the dog, he remembered. The moon hung high in the velvet sky, casting a silver glow over the quiet streets. The town lay in slumber, windows dark, the distant hum of crickets filling the silence. Mia pulled her coat tighter. Against the cold, her breath visible in the crisp night air. Ahead of her, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, the scruffy dog moved like a shadow, his small pouch swaying with each step. She had followed him before, always stopping when he disappeared into the unknown. But not tonight. Tonight, she needed to know where he went, why he collected coins as if they held something more than their worth. His pace was steady, unwavering, as if he had walked this path 1,000 times before. His paws barely made a sound against the cobblestone, slipping through alleyways and side streets as if guided by memory alone. Mia hesitated as they left the town's center, crossing the old bridge that led to the outskirts. The houses here were fewer, the streetlights dim. The road stretched before them, cracked and uneven, swallowed by overgrown grass on either side. The farther they went, the more the air shifted, thickening with something unspoken. A feeling, a whisper of something lost. Then she saw it. A skeletal structure loomed ahead, barely standing against the weight of time. The fence was rusted, its gate unhinged, swaying slightly in the wind. Beyond it, the remnants of a building stood, walls caved in, the roof half collapsed. The words on the faded sign were barely legible beneath layers of grime and peeling paint, but Mia could still make them out. Havenwood Animal Shelter. Buddy paused at the entrance, his small body rigid, ears perked. He took a single step forward, then another, as if walking across a threshold he had crossed before. Mia followed, her heart pounding. Inside, the scent of dust and damp earth filled the air. Shadows stretched across the floor, cast by the moon, filtering through shattered windows. Broken kennels lined the far wall, their doors rusted open. And there, in the center of the room, lay a small, dust-covered donation box. Buddy approached it slowly, nose to the ground, his tail still for the first time. Mia swallowed hard as she took in the sight before her. Deep claw marks ran along the edges of the wooden box, desperate and jagged. as if something, or someone, had tried to open it long after it had been abandoned. Buddy sat beside it, lowering his head. And for the first time since she had met him, he whimpered, not from hunger, not from cold, but from something deeper, something broken. A lump formed in Mia's throat as she crouched beside him. Her fingers brushed away the dust, revealing the faint, time-worn engraving along the top of the box for the strays. So they'll never be alone. Her vision blurred. The shelter had been forgotten, erased from the town's memory. But not by Buddy. He had come back, again and again, still trying to finish what had been started long ago. Her hands trembled as she reached for the lid, prying it open with gentle care. Inside, beneath the layer of dust, lay an old photograph. Mia's breath caught as she held it up to the light. A boy with bright eyes smiled back at her, a handmade sign clutched in his hands. The words, painted in uneven letters, were simple, yet full of hope. Help us save them. Beside him, a smaller version of Buddy stood, his leash looped around the boy's wrist. Mia's chest tightened. Daniel. She had read his name before, in an old newspaper article. The boy who had once fought to keep the shelter open. The boy who had spent his days collecting donations, just like Buddy did now. The boy who, one tragic day, never came home. Tears stung her eyes as she looked at the dog beside her. He had never stopped waiting, never stopped trying. The town had moved on, but Buddy had not. A sharp gust of wind sent a stack of old papers fluttering from the corner, scattering them across the floor. Mia reached for one, the edges brittle beneath her fingertips. She could barely make out the ink, but the words sent a shiver down her spine. Dear Mayor, please, don't take the shelter away. These animals have nowhere else to go. I promise I'll raise the money. Just give us more time. Sarah Carter, Daniel's mother. Mia pressed her hand over her mouth. The letter had never been sent, never been read. If it had, maybe things would have been different. Maybe the shelter would have been saved. Maybe Buddy wouldn't have. Spent years chasing a promise that had never been given the chance to come true. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. You've been trying to finish what he started, haven't you? Buddy lifted his head at her voice, his dark eyes shining with something deeper than understanding. He nudged his pouch forward, as if offering one last coin to a cause long lost. Mia clenched her fists. No, it wasn't lost. Not yet. Determination surged through her veins as she stood, her mind racing. The shelter wasn't beyond saving. It was broken, forgotten, but it still stood. And so did Buddy, and so did she. Her voice steadied. We're not letting this end here. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving with purpose. The town had forgotten. But she would make them remember. She would not let this story end in tragedy. The fundraiser began as a whisper of hope, a small flicker against the weight of time. Mia had expected hesitation, even doubt, but not the overwhelming response that followed. It started with a few curious donations, a handful of people moved by Buddy's story, slipping spare coins into the growing collection jar. Then the whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into action. Posters lined the bakery windows, their edges curling from the morning breeze. Flyers landed in mailboxes pinned to bulletin boards at the town's only cafe. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing at the picture of Buddy standing in front of the abandoned shelter, his pouch clutched tightly in his mouth. His quiet persistence, his unwavering determination, touched something deeper than sympathy. It stirred something long buried, yet not everyone believed in kindness. A group of older men sat outside the hardware store, shaking their heads over their coffee. It's a nice story, sure, one muttered, but it doesn't change the facts. That place is a wreck. What's the point in saving something that's already lost? A woman at the town meeting raised her voice, skepticism lacing her words. It's sad, but nostalgia doesn't fix broken buildings. The shelter had its time, and it's time to move on. Still, the donations kept coming, small but steady. Mia worked tirelessly, baking extra batches of bread, pouring herself into the cause, stretching every cent to push forward. But the opposition grew louder, and the real fight was only just beginning. The land had already been spoken for. Contracts had been signed, blueprints drafted. The shelter was marked for demolition, its remains nothing more than an obstacle in the town's plans for progress. A new shopping center would bring more business, more jobs. The past had no place in the future. Divisions ran deep. Some stood, with Mia and Buddy, believing in second chances. Others scoffed, dismissing the effort as futile sentimentality. The mayor called for a formal hearing, promising to hear both sides before making a final decision. But everyone knew where he stood. His focus was on progress, on promises made to developers. The shelter was a relic, a memory no longer useful. Mia felt the pressure closing in, the weight of doubt pressing against her ribs, but she refused to back down. At the heart of the resistance stood Mr. Grayson. He had once been a friend of Daniel's, mother, had once believed in the shelter's purpose. But time had turned him bitter, his past tangled in a web of resentment and loss. He had offered Sarah Carter a business deal long ago, a chance to sell the land and secure a better future for herself and her son. But she had refused. Her heart had been with the shelter, with the animals, with the dream of creating a safe haven for the forgotten. Now he saw the shelter as nothing more than a painful reminder of what could have been. It was easier to bury the past than to face it. The weight of his presence loomed over every meeting, his voice steady, authoritative, unwavering. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills," he said. "Holding on to the past won't bring anyone back." The words struck deep. Mia clenched her fists beneath the table, her pulse pounding. And tearing it down won't erase it either. Tension crackled between them, but Mr. Grayson remained unmoved. He had power. He had the law on his side, and he had already set things in motion. A week later, the official notice arrived. Stamped in bold ink, the message was clear. Cease all activity immediately. Mia stared at the letter in her hands, her breath catching in her throat. The shelter was no longer just a battle of hearts. It was a legal fight. And she was losing. The storm arrived that night. Thunder cracked across the sky, lightning illuminating the skeletal remains of the shelter. Rain fell in sheets, cold and relentless, washing over the broken walls, seeping through the cracks. The wind howled through the empty halls, rattling the rusted kennel doors, and then the roof gave in, a loud, shattering crash echoed through the night as the last standing beam collapsed, sending debris scattering across the muddy ground. Water flooded through the remains, pooling in the corners where warmth had once lived. Buddy stood in the wreckage, his body drenched, his pouch soaked through. He did not move. He did not nudge the pouch forward. He only stared at the ruins before him, his tail still. For the first time, he stopped collecting. Mia ran to him, her feet splashing through the rising water, her heart lodged in her throat. She dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers trembling as they reached for his soaked fur. "Buddy," her voice broke. "We'll fix this. We'll find another way." But he didn't move. He didn't wag his tail or press the pouch into her hands. He only lowered his head, his body sagging under the weight of something far heavier than rain. Behind them, the town stood silent. People gathered at a distance, watching from their dry doorsteps, their umbrellas shielding them from the storm. No one stepped forward. No one offered a hand. Mia clenched her fists. The shelter was gone. The donations weren't enough. And maybe Mr. Grayson was right. Maybe the past was meant to stay buried. Mia stood at the front of the town hall, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. The murmurs of the gathered townspeople swirled around her, blending into a low, uncertain hum. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the faces in the crowd, some familiar, some skeptical, some waiting for her to fail. She swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice was steady as she began. I know many of you believe this shelter is nothing but a broken building, that what we're fighting for is just bricks and walls. But that's not the truth. Behind her, a large screen flickered to life, displaying the photograph she had found. The one of Daniel standing in front of the shelter, Buddy at his side, his homemade sign pleading for help. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. This isn't just a shelter, Mia continued, her gaze sweeping the room. This was a home, a place where second chances were given, a place where kindness meant something. She hesitated before adding, and a place that a boy once tried to save with everything he had. She could see the mayor's unimpressed expression from where he sat at the long table, flanked by city officials. His fingers drummed against the wooden surface, his lips pressed into a thin line. When she finished speaking, he sighed and shook his head. I understand your sentiment, Miss Carter, he said. But this decision has already been made. The shelter will be demolished. The words hit like a hammer, final and cold. A murmur of disappointment swept through the room. Mia felt the breath leave her lungs, but before she could speak, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor cut through the air. An elderly man rose from the back of the room. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cane, but his voice was strong. That letter, he said, his gaze fixed on the screen, should have been read a long time ago. The room went still. Mia watched as the man made his way forward. His presence commanding yet gentle. Some whispered, recognizing him. Others watched in stunned silence. Who is he? Someone murmured. The man reached the front, his tired eyes scanning the faces before settling on the mayor. Daniel was my grandson, he said, and a hush fell over the room. Mia's breath caught as he pulled a worn envelope from his coat pocket. I didn't think I'd ever see this again, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. It was a letter from my daughter. She fought for that shelter, even when the town had already given up. He held the letter up, the paper yellowed with age, its ink faded but still clear. The silence in the hall was deafening as he opened it with shaking fingers. My mother wrote to the mayor before she died, he continued. She pleaded for more time. She promised she would raise the money to save the shelter. His voice faltered. But no one ever read her words. The weight of lost time hung heavy in the air. Mia looked at Mr. Grayson, watching as the color drained from his face. His hands clenched at the arms of his chair, his usual stern demeanor cracking at the edges. The letter trembled in the old man's hands as he read the words aloud, his voice breaking. A mother's plea, a promise unfulfilled, a hope that had never been given the chance to bloom. Mia turned to Mr. Grayson, her voice softer now. You told us to move on, she said, but can you really stand here and say that was the right choice? For the first time, he didn't respond. A shuffle of movement caught everyone's attention. Buddy, who had been sitting quietly beside Mia, struggled to his feet. His paws moved slowly, his limbs stiff with exhaustion. His pouch, worn and soaked from the storm, dragged along the floor as he limped forward. The hush deepened. Buddy stopped at Mia's feet, his dark eyes filled with something deeper than exhaustion. He nudged his pouch open with his nose and a single coin rolled onto the floor. Mia felt a lump form in her throat. The simple, quiet action spoke louder than any speech ever could. One final offering. One last chance. A sniffle broke the silence, and then a child stepped forward. A little girl, no older than 6, clutched a small handful of coins in her tiny fist. She hesitated only for a second before stepping closer and dropping them into Buddy's pouch. The sound of the coins landing echoed through the hall. Then, another person stepped forward. Then another. A teenager emptied her pocket of spare change. A man who had once scoffed at the fundraiser reached into his wallet and placed a bill into the pouch. One by one, people came forward, some with crumpled dollar bills, others with loose change, but all with something more powerful than money. Hope. The town, once divided, was now standing together. Tears blurred Mia's vision as she knelt beside Buddy, her hand resting against his matted fur. You did it, she whispered. You never gave up. And neither would she. The decision was made, but the moment felt unreal. Silence hung thick in the town hall, stretching long and uncertain before the weight of reality sank in. The mayor's voice had been firm, but different this time. No longer a declaration, but an acknowledgement. The shelter will not be demolished, he had said. The town stands with it. For the first time in years, kindness had won. Applause erupted, filling the room like a long-awaited breath of fresh air. People cheered, some clapping wildly, others simply smiling, nodding at one another as if remembering what it felt like to believe in something again. Mia exhaled, a shaky, disbelieving laugh escaping her lips as she turned to Buddy. He sat beside her, ears perked, watching everything unfold with quiet patience, just as he always had. But amid the celebration, one figure remained still, Mr. Grayson had not moved. He sat stiffly in his chair at the far end of the hall, his hands clasped together, his gaze locked on the floor. He had spent years trying to erase the past, convincing himself that it didn't matter. But now, faced with the truth, with the undeniable weight of it, he could no longer ignore what had always been there. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. The crowd quieted as he stepped forward, his movements hesitant, deliberate. His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with something unfamiliar, something raw. Let me help. Mia's breath caught. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but the room had fallen into stunned silence, every eye on him. He cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably under the attention. For too long, he continued, I let my own bitterness stand in the way of what was right. Daniel's mother believed in this shelter, in this town. I refused to see it. But I see it now. His gaze flickered to Buddy, then to Mia. If you'll allow me, I'd like to help rebuild it. The silence held for only a beat before. The room erupted again, not just in applause, but in something deeper. Forgiveness. A second chance. And just like that, the past loosened its grip. Days turned to weeks, and the broken shelter began to breathe again. The wreckage was cleared, new walls were raised, fresh paint covered old scars. The town came together, donating supplies, volunteering time. Laughter filled the once empty space, the echo of hammers and the scent of fresh wood replacing the silence of decay. Through it all, Mr. Grayson remained. He worked alongside them, never leading, never seeking recognition, but there, present. He brought in the final donation, ensuring the shelter had everything it needed to not just survive, but thrive. And with that, for the first time in years, he let go of the past. When the last piece of the shelter was put in place, Buddy sat in the center of the courtyard, watching as the final touches were added. A mural stretched across the front wall, a painting of Daniel and his mother, standing with open arms, the words, Havenwood Animal Shelter, a place for second chances, written beneath them. Buddy's tail thumped softly against the ground as he stared at the image, his body still, as if he understood that this moment was what he had waited for. Mia knelt beside him, brushing her fingers gently against his fur. You did it, Buddy, she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The old dog leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. His mission was complete. The shelter became more than a building. It became a symbol, a testament to kindness, to perseverance, to the power of one small act changing everything. The townspeople who had once ignored the little dog with his pouch now carried his story forward. Schools visited the shelter, families adopted pets, people came not just to take, but to give. A plaque was placed beneath the mural, engraved with words that would never be forgotten. Even the smallest act of kindness can spark a movement that changes everything. Time moved on as it always did. But some things, some stories, never truly end. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a small whimper broke the quiet. Mia turned toward the shelter's entrance, her eyes widening at the sight of a tiny, trembling puppy standing just outside the gate. It was thin, barely more than fur and bones, its eyes wide with uncertainty. Before Mia could move, Buddy did. Slowly, carefully, he pushed himself up, his old joints aching, but his spirit unshaken. With quiet determination, he limped forward, stopping in front of the tiny pup. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, one at the beginning of the journey, the other at its end. Then, Buddy nudged his pouch forward. A single coin tumbled out. Mia's chest tightened as she knelt beside them, her throat thick with emotion. The cycle was beginning again. The same kindness that had saved Buddy, that had saved the shelter, would now save another. The old dog sat beside the pup, his job not yet finished, because kindness never truly ends. It simply passes on,